want to call this meeting to order at 9:08 or 9:09. The purpose of this meeting this morning is for the board to discuss and review the resumes from the interim superintendent search. And at this time, I'm going to turn this over to Andrea Masiva.
Thank you. Yes, let me walk you through the materials that you have in front of you and kind of tell you how we're going to structure the meeting today, if you'll all agree with this. The first item you're going to find is a little workshop summary sheet, and this is what's on the table that Bill drafted after we met last time. What we tried to do was sort of summarize all of the content that everyone shared that they were looking for and the goals. And then we used these items for Bill. Bill and I started working on a draft for the questions for Monday, which we'll finish talking about that later after we look at who you might be interviewing. But we just wanted to share that with you. The second item you'll see is the actual full listing of all of the applicants. There are 48 applicants whose packets, resume, and cover letter were received before the deadline, so you have that. Then you should have two versions of what we call the tally sheet. One is a color-coded version, and the other one is a black and white version. Now, the black and white version is the first version that we're going to use. And before we even get to that, I do want to briefly mention how impressed we were, number one, that you had 48 people interested in applying for your superintendent position. And many of them, obviously you can only bring in one person as your interim superintendent, but there were some really interesting applications that may not have been as traditional as some other applications. And so we were encouraged by a lot of the applications and sincerely hope that the people who applied for the interim position will remain interested if they don't get the interim position, because you might be looking for something different in an interim than you'd be looking for in a permanent, but that they would remain interested and hopefully apply again when your permanent position comes open. So we wanted to sort of set the tone with that. There are a number of qualified people in here who have served as superintendents both in Florida and in other states. There are people who could come in here tomorrow and start running your district because they've worked in Florida. There are others who, as I said, have been superintendents in other states, that there may be a learning curve, but it depends on how and which way you guys want to go with that. If we could focus on the applicant's strengths when we talk about them, number one, you're going to be asking people to come in on Monday for interviews, and ideally, if it's possible, if we can keep the conversation positive about all of them today while we're looking to find agreement on who you'd like to interview, that's going to set the stage for more effective interviews on Monday. And then finally, when we spoke last week, you indicated that trying to find a goal of no less than 2, possibly 3 to interview. With that in mind, we've structured the conversation to try to hone in on areas of agreement. So that's where the black and white version of the tally sheet comes in. What I'd like each of you to do in the column that has your name is sort of put a check mark on the candidate numbers that you'd like the board to discuss potentially interviewing. And once you do that on your column with your name, if you could pass it to me, then I'll read them out and we'll do the tally sheets together so we'll all see where agreement is found. So if you can do that first on the black and white sheet just in your column, and then of course at the end nothing, it's a public record, we'll give it to the custodian of records and all of that.
Is there a minimum, maximum
Nope.
number you're looking
Nope.
for here?
No, who you think you'd like the board to discuss,
Okay.
potentially interviewing.
I getting to see this too?
I'll take it. I'm like the teacher I was waiting for kids to finish with their little quizzes.
Well,
God bless you.
God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you. There's 2 sheets.
oh, it's okay.
Okay,
It's,
can I get this?
yeah, sure.
Just so we have it as part of the record.
Yep. Um, can I have mine back a second?
You bet. Two sheets. Thank you. Oh, okay. So then now, if you can go to your color-coded sheet, we'll do the tally marks here. I've got Chair Laura Zork would like to discuss candidate number 2, candidate number 11, and candidate number 35. Candidates numbers 2, 11, and 35.
Then second page.
It's on the back.
Right. All right. Vice Chair Tiffany Justice would like to discuss candidate,
Excuse me.
I'm sorry.
On this,
There is a second page to.
Oh, thank you. Candidate number 47. Thank you. I apologize for that. All right. Vice Chair Tiffany Justice would like to discuss candidate number 1, candidate number 4, candidate number 35, candidate number 40. Okay. Terry Berenborg would like to discuss candidate 1, candidate 2, candidate 4, candidate 15, candidate 31, candidate 35, candidate 40. Okay. Jackie Rosario would like to discuss candidate number 2, candidate number 4, candidate number 35, and candidate number 46. Dr. Schiff would like to discuss candidate number 2. That's an erase mark here, correct? Okay. Candidate number 11. Candidate number 35. Okay. So it looks like candidate number 1 has 2 people that would like to discuss. Candidate number 2 has 4 people that would like to discuss. Candidate 4 has 3 people. Candidate 11 has 2. 15 has 1. 31 has 1. 35 has 5. 40 has 2. 46 has 1. And 47 has 1. Does anybody have data different? Okay, so typically what we'd like to do is kind of start where there's areas of most agreement to see if you'd like to bring or invite those areas of most agreement, those people who have the highest levels of agreement, in for interviews, and we'll work our way backward, okay? Looking at candidate number 35. we have Dr. Susan Moxley. And you all saw her resume, you all saw her cover letter. She is a retired Florida superintendent. She was 9 years of service in Lake County. She also served in Orange County. So would it be agreeable to all of you, since 5 of you indicated an interest in talking to her, should we go ahead and say that we would like to invite Dr. Moxley for an interview on Monday? Is that okay with everyone?
I'm fine with that.
Okay. I do need to tell you that Dr. Moxley, check my notes on what she told me exactly. She is traveling in a Winnebago on Monday. She said that she will absolutely be able to communicate via electronic means, so we'll figure out how to do that. She's traveling with her husband to a home out west, but she's actually flying home, I think, on Wednesday of next week. So she will be here, and she said she could meet the start date if that's what the board ended up deciding. Yes?
I spoke with her last night.
Oh, okay.
And she said she was planning on coming back Sunday night in case she could be available for us on Monday.
Oh, this Sunday coming up? Okay, well, then you've spoken to her more recently than I.
Yeah,
Okay,
just last night.
all right. So,
So that might be, it might be better, you know.
yes, I will reach out to her, but it may not require electronic communication. Perfect. All right. Then we go to the candidate of next highest agreement. There are 4 people who are interested in bringing in Dr. James Parla for an interview. So let's see, we've got, he does live locally. He has a doctorate's degree. He certainly has superintendent experience, but he was not in Florida with his superintendent experience. It's just one of the notes that I have. So with 4 people interested in talking to Dr. Parla, I'd like to know if you all would like to bring Dr. Parla in for an interview, or if you'd like to have conversation around Dr. Parla.
I'd like to share something about
Sure.
that. Well, it seems that, and I know we're going to keep this positive, but I am going to give some insight as to why I did not select Dr. Parla. Considering all of the intricacies of Florida law and statute and serving as a superintendent in Florida, and given some of the conversations I've had with other school board members regarding interims in general and the effectiveness of an interim during that period of time, I feel that it's in the best interest of for the taxpayers and the families and students of our county to have someone that has served as a superintendent of schools in the state of Florida. So that is the reason why I did not choose to have Dr. Parla come and interview.
Okay. Did anybody else have any comments that you wanted to bring to the board's attention on perhaps why you would like to interview Dr. Parla?
Sure. I agree with your considerations, and Andrea's mentioned that, and you mentioned that about Florida. Having looked really carefully at the resumes and done a whole spreadsheet on a number of different characteristics, my concern, while I agree with that, is that other than Dr. Moxley, right? I didn't see another candidate with Florida experience who rose to the level of other background experience, education, that I felt as confident in. So while I agree that Florida experience is important, I'm torn between the degree to which, for me, Florida experience would outweigh lack of credentials or experience in other categories. And I tried. I organized, reorganized, cut my spreadsheet 6 ways from Tuesday to find somebody with Florida experience who I felt rose to the top for me as much, and I couldn't find it.
So may I? I understand what you're saying, and I hear you. My concern would be, as far as a long-term superintendent, I could see that being something that would definitely be taken into consideration, given the time frame where we are and the budget process that we're about to enter. I feel that some of the intricacies of learning about Florida statute and the FEFP and working through the budget process right now, it would be advantageous for us to work with someone who has worked within those confines before. So while I agree with you that the credentials are impressive and that for a superintendent going forward, I don't believe that for me personally, that someone will have to have experience in the state of Florida to be considered. In this specific instance right now, I feel it's important, and I feel it's important.
Something that really stood out to me is not only did he have superintendent experience, but the financial wherewithal, because with him, I believe it was Columbia University that he teaches finance and economics for Columbia University. That tells me that he can quickly shift. And with him living here in Florida for the past, I'm not for sure, was it 5 years, and being a superintendent, I'm pretty confident that he's been taking a look and studying the Florida structure. So I feel confident that he has the ability to put on the Florida hat very quickly.
After,
Dr. Ms.
Thank you.
Rosario.
I spoke with Dr. Parla last night as well, yesterday, and Dr. Parla, I agree with Mrs. Zork. Dr. Parla teaches a PhD school finance program at Columbia University. And what he explained to me is that even though he hasn't had Florida district experience in the area of school finance, he has students fly in from all over the country, from various different states into the Columbia program. And from an educational perspective, for someone to teach at that high-level degree of school finance, you have to have, in his case, understanding of various states and how their financial districts are run, how the states are run, rather. So he has familiarity. I'm confident that he'll be able to help in that aspect. He said that is his forte, is school finance. School finance overall, though some of the laws, obviously are different from state to state, for the most part, there are similarities in terms of budgeting, maybe not the line items specifically, but I do believe that he's certainly one of the highest candidates here that rose to a similar number in terms of that rubric that you gave us. I did the rubric, and he was very close with Dr. Moxley on the numbers, in the number scale. One of his other fortes is building up low morale in school districts. He was faced, and of course, if you all decide to bring him in an interview, you can ask him, but we talked a little bit about that as well, that he encouraged me that is one of his fortes as well. I think that it's worth the opportunity to bring him in to interview. I don't see anyone else who obviously we have, 5 unanimously for 35 and 4 for number 2. Though I appreciate Mrs. Justice's concerns, I think that he warrants an invitation to come in for an interview. Oh, I'm sorry, I might also add that he does currently sit on our board, the board for our Treasure Coast Technical College. Mm-hmm. So he is not completely displaced from what's happening here with us.
I would say that since there's not unanimity, maybe we should go through some of these others, because if we're only looking for
It's fine.
2 or 3 people to,
Yeah, this is fine. Let's move forward. I mean, I have 4 board members who seem to feel that he's a qualified candidate. I'm sorry.
Can I just make a point?
Mhm.
Maybe this will help. having looked at all the resumes and all the background and everything else, I agree with you. I think it's important that we look for somebody with an extremely solid background. He has that. He has really positive things being said about him out there when I researched. And I think he's worth at least interviewing, even though I share your concerns that I think somebody needs to know Florida. But seeing that he does serve on a board of our school and he's local, I think let's give him a shot of an interview.
And I say that's fine. I think in this unique situation that we find ourselves without a CFO, we do have someone that's contracting with us now who has an enormous amount of Florida school district finance experience. But we are contracting with him, and he is not, Mr. Rajan is not coming on to our staff. So that really was where I look for some Florida experience, but I have 4 board members who seem to feel that this is someone that we should interview, so I'll support that, and we should put them on the list, put him on Dr. Parla on the list to interview.
Okay, so then is anyone opposed to bringing Dr. Parla in for an interview?
No.
All right, so we've got 2 so far. So before we commit to any others, let's just keep moving through them. The next highest score is candidate number 4, which is Janelle Yost. Janelle, some of you may actually know Janelle because she was from St. Lucie County, which is next door to you, and she does have Florida superintendent experience. And 3 of you indicated interest in bringing her in. So if anybody wants to speak affirmatively so that we can begin the conversation about Ms. Yost.
I'll say it's the only person that I saw with interim experience, and it's a unique position to be in. I find that to be interesting. I have spoken with some board members from St. Lucie County who had very positive things to say. And so I think that it's definitely someone that we should consider.
I believe I will probably have some knowledge on this. Mrs. Yost was my supervisor for 5 years when I was a principal. She held me to extremely high standard, and I think brought the best out of me, even though at times I was frustrated with how much she was trying to get out of me. But I will say that I respect her. I can't say enough great things about how she handled some of the things we're struggling with, which is negotiations. She, if you'll look, do some research, you'll see what she went through as far as some negotiation contracts with the teachers union and the CWA down there. She also went through my budget with me, line by line, all the time. She's very astute as to detail. She keeps really, really detailed records, and taught me to do the same. So I think she is definitely a person that I was surprised she applied, but very, very thankful that she did. I respect her 110%.
Wow. Any other comments?
I'll speak to why I didn't put her on the list. Sort of. I appreciate your comments because you have direct experience with her. She isn't the only one with interim experience. There were a bunch of other ones who,
Florida,
including Dr. Parla, who also had interim
I'm
experience.
sorry, Florida, interim experience.
My hesitation, but she was on my top list, and then on this chart, it was kind of a last minute, I didn't put her in. In looking at some of our history, I want to be really conscious and conscientious about how we have, for better and worse, brought in a lot of people from St. Lucie. And I want to be attentive to that, and I want to be conscious about that, both, I don't know her, so I'm not against interviewing her. And so this is simply a on-paper look, which is very different than a in-person look. But I want to be thoughtful about how we do that, both in action and in perception. And that was part of, for me, where I struggled some. And her superintendent experience, as I recall, was short. I think it was only 2 years.
I can give you the perspective on that if you
Yeah.
want it. She actually was in drop when the position became open. The board offered it to her, but, you know, she had to complete her drop.
Okay.
And so that's why she only served, was it 2 years? Yeah.
Yeah.
I respect that. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I respect that. I think my thing was that to not interview someone with that type of experience,
Right.
who has worked with the person that we've contracted to, as a
True.
CFO, and they've worked well together to build budgets, it would seem, especially for such a small period of time, it would seem advantageous in some ways.
I don't disagree. And in the same way that bringing somebody in who has relationships is simultaneously an advantage and a disadvantage.
Sure,
And I'm not arguing one way or the other. I'm saying I want to be attentive to it.
I recognize that the relationship I'm speaking of, and let me be clear about that, Mr. Bargeron was the CFO in St. Lucie
Oh, yeah,
County, and he's been contracted here. So he's here for a
No, I
very
get that.
short period. I just wanted to say, for a short period of time, so that was.
And I'm, so far in my limited experience with him, I think he's terrific. I am really, really grateful that he's here at this moment. So it's not actually about that at all. And there are advantages to a superintendent who can work well with our budget person in this current season, and we don't know what that's going to look like moving forward. So, but those are just in voicing some of why she wasn't. She was actually on my top some number of people. But I have reservations, but those are, as I said, not because I have personal experience with her, which others do.
So I did have a couple of concerns, but I don't feel like I need to address those. But what I saw was, like, for number 11, when I compare the strengths, you know, even though number 11 didn't have the Florida experience, but I look at the experience that he has versus what number 4 has, you know, and we're already at 2, and if we can only interview 3, I just, I don't feel like number 4 is the best person to bring in if we're limited to 3.
Well,
Sorry.
Go ahead.
no.
I think it's interesting that both Mrs. Zork and I saw some. What appealed to me about 11, while not Florida experience, was this is a really bad way of putting it. But looking through his experience and what he'd done and doing some research on him, he looks like the guy that people call to come in this situation. He looks like the guy that people call in when a system like this is challenged. He kind of looks like, bad term for it, but like a fixer. And that was what put him on my list. I saw things in him where he had been in this situation, and he had, where was it? There was a particular thing, it's going to take me a minute to find it, where he looked like, here it was, his consulting, provide client services in state and school district efficiency and effectiveness, specializing in district administration, school finances, strategic planning, finance studies, et cetera. All, like, this is the business that he does, is he goes in and he analyzes this, and then from what I read about him, comes in and looks at what are we doing, how are we doing it, how do we make it more effective and efficient. The limitation was the lack of Florida experience, but like Dr. Parla, I really liked the breadth of his experience. So that's just a.
Okay, we've had some comments on 4, comments on 11. Would anybody like to share a few comments on candidate number 1? And then we'll move to 40. Candidate number 1 is Dr. Peggy Jones.
Yeah, I'll speak. The reason why I brought Dr. Jones up in our meeting before is, first of all, to spur the conversation about let's get going with thinking about an interim, not knowing that Dr. Rendell had actually secured another position while I was saying that. But I also knew that this was imminent and this conversation needed to happen. So Dr. Jones is, I've received, I'm sure you all have, lots of calls and comments and letters and things like that about several of the candidates. And there are many people that have spoken positive of Dr. Jones. However, she doesn't have the experience that others have. One thing she has is that she was here recently and in the school district and working internally and knows our staff really well. So that's why I put her as one of my choices.
I'll speak to why I put her on as well, because I wanted to be able to have a discussion about Dr. Jones. I do not feel that she is qualified right now to serve as the interim superintendent, to be frank. I think she has amazing qualifications, and she has served this district incredibly well, and I'm thankful for her. And I respected the fact that you brought her up, and I really respect the fact that she was willing to throw her hat in to do it. I'm thankful that she was willing to do that. Again, I have made it very clear, I think we need someone who has previous superintendent experience, and further to that point, someone who has Florida superintendent experience, given some of the challenges that we are dealing with right now. And so I wanted to be able to discuss this and say thank you to her. I have been approached by a lot of people, staff in the district, that have advocated for Dr. Jones to be considered, and I felt that it was the right thing to do to have a discussion about that. But to be honest, when I'm looking at a top three, she would not be in my top three.
I do want to be clear, what was it, 2 or 3 meetings ago, when you did present her resume initially, and why she's candidate number 1 is because we just put that resume in the stack. But I did go back and reaffirm with her that she was still interested in applying, and as you know, she sent some updated materials. So I just wanted to be clear on that. Anybody else? All right, let's have some conversation around candidate number 40, Dr. Roger Deering, who many people also in this district know.
I'm a little confused as to how we continue. I mean, there were two. We have 3 people that have the three top. Can we just move forward with those 3 people?
We could, if that's what the board wants to do.
I mean, it's very clear, it's 5, we have a 5, a 4, and a 3, and then the others are all 2s or 1s. So I'd like to know if we could just move forward with interviewing those 3 candidates.
Just to be clear, that would be candidates number 35, which was Dr. Moxley, candidate 2, which was Dr. Parla, and candidate 4, which is Janelle Yost. Anybody opposed?
I'm not quite opposed to it. I had the same thought, but I am interested because I was on the fence with candidate number 40, and I think I would like to hear, from my colleagues, those who checked that candidate off, just to get their perspective on that candidate. So after that, I'm totally okay with going with our top 3 at that point, but I would like to hear some feedback on 40, if that's okay.
Okay, is that, candidate 40 was Dr. Roger Deering.
Can I, number 40, I had chosen 4, but I was open to the 5th, and we have a really good no. I have heard positive, and and also on the flip side, but I'm not opposed to 40. If we could interview 4, I would say yes, let's interview him. But his resume was very very short and not really as extensive as the other resumes. So that's why originally I wasn't even, some of the resumes were just dynamic, and you could just basically read them like a book and understand all their accomplishments. With number 40, because I don't really know the individual, it was hard for me to determine. So
You guys can interview whatever number you want. I mean, we were targeting 2 to 3, but if you want to move to 4, that's a decision for you all certainly to make.
Will time allow for 4?
It will. I will tell you for Dr. Deering, he's got an appointment in the,
I actually want to take that back. There's only 2 check marks there. So I really feel like we have 3 people. They're the 3 top. to start, if you consider him for an interview at 2, then you're going to consider everyone for the 4th interview for 2. I've heard, I don't know Dr. Deering. I know that he did serve as superintendent here. And I've heard, again, some wonderful things about him, and some people have really advocated on his behalf, and I've heard some things that weren't as wonderful. I've just found it to be very interesting. I think the institutional knowledge is as helpful as it is detrimental in some ways, and so that's concerning. We have 3 people that seem to be qualified to be able to serve in this capacity. We said we were going to interview 2 to 3, so I'd be comfortable moving forward with the top 3 that we had on the list.
I think this process, we need to be flexible, because originally we were thinking that we were shooting for 5 to 6 resumes, and not really realizing that we're going to have as many qualified candidates as we have. I don't disagree that if, I 100% agree on the 35, number 2, and, I would be willing and be open to, and I'm open to number 4, but I don't think that we should rule out number 40 because there's only 2 checks there. I think me coming into this, I was open to conversation, and that was what I had thought that we were going to do, is discuss these.
So I guess my answer would be, I'm one of those check marks, and in discussion, having listened to my fellow board members, I would actually say that at this point, I've kind of reconsidered that position. And I would say that I've heard some things from fellow board members that have led me to say, yes, let's interview Dr. Parler. There seems to be, a consensus amongst board members, and I respect your opinions. And so for me, as one of the checks, I would say, okay, let's step back from that at that point and move forward with the top 3.
I'd like to say the same thing. I respect Dr. Deering. I had a lot of people contact me about the positives of Dr. Deering. I did have some people talk about some concerns, but we're going to get that in any candidate.
Yeah.
You are. I think what we need, though, is to consider morale and moving forward, and somebody that has a knowledge base. I think Mrs. Yost, I think she deserves an interview. I think you'd be surprised, and not all people that have served in St. Lucie are bad.
By no means was I saying that.
And
By no
I
means.
think that she's not connected to other people like you think. So I think she deserves that right to come in and interview and speak about the topics that we ask her. So I would like to move that we go with the top 3.
So are you withdrawing your,
I'm not withdrawing.
4,
I wanted to
40?
discuss him, but
so
I think that given that we have, I think our goal is to come up with a person that we all agree on. And I think if right now we're hemming and hawing over somebody, I think that that's just going to muddy the waters on Monday. I'd rather that we go with the strongest candidates and move forward with that.
I agree.
Yeah, I would also echo that, like others, I've heard both positive and negative things. What I am mostly concerned with right now, and you've said this before, is culture, climate, relationships, and building back that level of trust and health, mental, emotional, physical health in the district. And someone around whom there's controversy, who has been in the district before, brings a host of things that may or may not be healing. So I agree. I'm good with the top 3 that we've identified.
I see hesitation.
No, I just, my hesitation is, even though I might have heard negative, I've heard some really wonderful things, and I just, what has been asked of me is just give him a chance to interview, because you will be blown away. And I feel like I'm, by not just allowing that respect of the chance of an interview, because I really didn't get everything I wanted on the paper. I just.
Can I respond to that too?
I haven't responded, so after you, go ahead.
As a professional who's been in the work that I do for a long time, and like you, I've heard great things and not great things. But to me, whether or not this is something that you're really interested or not, when I see a resume that doesn't really look like a resume, it's sort of a written statement of qualifications, that gives me a little bit of pause. I've seen it before, but there's a certain, in some of the other ones, and this has come up before, there's a level of professionalism in the materials that I'm being handed. For example, Dr. Moxley, as soon as I read her cover letter, my ears perked up. Like, this was such a well-written letter. When I see something that doesn't feel like that, it just, again, raises my attention. And while this by no means, I don't know the man personally, by no means qualifies or disqualifies, it gives me pause. And it doesn't mean that he's more or less professional than anybody else, but all I've got to go on is what I see in paper. And when what I see on paper doesn't meet a certain thing that I personally am looking for, I'm not speaking for anybody else, that just, now, if we're gonna do a fourth interview, and we can agree on a time and a way to manage that, I would not shut down anybody else's intention to run a fourth interview. I don't feel strongly enough about it, nor would I want to shut down the voice of any other board member who does feel strongly about it. But unless we can make that happen in terms of time and priority, then I'm good with the 3.
Just a quick question for Mrs. Zork. You're interested in at least bringing him in for an interview, is that right? But you didn't check him off as one of your options, right?
Well, what did
So help me
my sheet, I
considering it.
my sheet said, I was open to the 5th,
Oh, she did say that. She says
And
chose 4
I-
but open to 5th. She did say that.
so,
Chose 4,
which
but
was
open to 5th?
to the 40th.
Yeah, she chose 4, but she would be open to putting in a 5th person.
Oh. So I have a little bit, still speaking on candidate number 40. I've never met Mr. Dr. Deering. I've heard equally from many people, good and not so good. I do understand that there is a level of controversy that may come with many different people. But one of the reasons why I asked for a cover letter when we were discussing what the requirements were to apply for this position is because I think a cover letter speaks volumes to the intent of the person applying. And many of the resumes that I went through, I mean, for me as an administrator, I guess maybe it's my training, if there's no cover letter and we're asking for it, I almost don't even want to look at the rest of it because you're almost disregarding the process of, you know, the basics, what we're asking for in terms of application and candidacy. And even though candidate number 40, Dr. Deering, submitted a cover letter, it really was, quite honestly, and the resume wasn't attractive, it wasn't something that caught my eye. It seemed a very narrative informed, but then very confusing. You couldn't tell the years of experience. You had to really read through. It wasn't an interest of mine until I started to receive some phone calls from people that said the same thing. Please just interview him. He's not one of my top candidates. I'm open all day on Monday. If you all want a 4th candidate, I'm certainly open to that. Like Dr. Schiff, I would prefer personally not to, but I'm certainly open to having that 4th interview. I'll leave it up to the board for that one, but I wanted to be able to explain that much.
So the question really then before you is, how many of you are interested in having a 4th interview? So I see at least 1 interested. I see 1. So that leaves us with 3 to interview. And we already have agreement on candidate 35 and candidate 2. candidate 4 had the numbers, but we didn't get official agreement on bringing in candidate 4. So let me go back to that one. That was Janelle Yost.
I think we said the top 3 people. That
Yeah.
would be the 5, 4, and 3.
I just
We
know
could
we
just move
we
forward.
individually not voted, but
Sure, if we could move forward with the top 3 people, and then
Is-
we had some 2s and some 1s, but
are there any other of the ones that anybody indicated, even with a 1, that you would just like to bring to the board's attention before we totally move forward? Terry?
Yes, because, originally my thought was to get it down to 3 when it came to this meeting, and here I am, the one with the most. And the reason why I wanted just to point out those other people is because I did a lot of research on the internet. I did not call the candidates because I wanted to be fair. I couldn't call 48 people. So I wanted to be fair and just look at all of the paper. Because, when you're filtering through the first time, that's what you want to do. When you get down to your finals, of course, call, talk to them, whatever. But that's just my personal way I go about it. I will say this, there were a couple of people on paper that looked great, and then there were others that looked fantastic, and then I did my research. And that's why I came down to the ones that I had checked off. And I think they're worth looking at. I would encourage them to apply for the superintendent position. I think they're worth looking at for that. Yeah, and when it comes down to it, I kind of got the same feeling like it needs to be somebody that knows Florida or is local and knows our district. So that's why I'm not going to advocate for the others. However, they're worth looking at.
And I do agree with you. It does seem that we have some pretty clear direction with these 3, but before we kind of close that door, I just want to make sure everyone's voice was heard. Yeah.
Yeah, I have one, David McGehee, Dr. McGehee. I don't know if you all, he had the best-looking resume.
And that's number,
And
16,
I
or
mean,
sorry, 46.
I would love to have him interview for the interim, but he has no Florida experience. And so I think he would probably be one that I would highly encourage if he's listening to apply for the superintendent position. I am extremely intrigued by everything that he's provided. And he was the one that, I put him down for the possibility of discussing him. Could he start on day 1 and as an interim? Absolutely. I don't know if putting him as a possible interview for an interim, having him relocate because he's out of state, of course, and then to not give him the full superintendent position wouldn't be a smart move altogether. I'm kind of just talking this out loud. But nonetheless, for a superintendent position, I think he's someone to consider. If he were to listen, again, he can apply, but I was highly impressed with what I saw here. So just to bring up the one candidate that we have to discuss, that was my one.
anybody else have any comments they wanted to make? Okay, then if it is the will of the board, we will extend invitations for interviews to candidates number 2, 4, and 35, which would be Dr. Parla, Janelle Yost, and Dr. Moxley. Mhm.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, yeah, let me go through a few next steps, if
That's
that's okay with you all.
Go ahead.
Let me just find my next
Well, I
steps
wanna
notes. Next steps. You will continue to get lobbied, as clearly you already have been. There are people who know all of these candidates, and so you will continue to hear from people. I know that it's important as an elected official to listen to people, but I also know that you all have been elected to make the decision, so I just kind of wanted to remind you of that. Second is that, and I'm going to let Dr. Vogel talk to you briefly about his development of some of the questions that we would like to submit to you. And we have different categories of questions. Typically, what we would do in these interviews, as we mentioned, we wanted sort of an hour interview with each person. So we would have categoricals, instruction, morale building, different categoricals. And so each person would take one category and ask the questions within that category to all of the candidates, so that all the candidates have the same questions, so there's an actual ability to compare their answers. We'll give you some suggested questions. We're not going to give you 20 because that's a little much for the time limit that we have. But we'll give you 2 or 3 per category, and you can choose those, or you can choose your own as you see fit. We're just trying to kind of help facilitate the process as it goes. Once we know who's going to get what category, like I said, I'll let Dr. Vogel work you through that. Then we'll send out the draft to you all later today, and then you'll have that for Monday. I'll have you do that in just a second, and then, yep, okay, that's it. That's on my list.
Great,
So,
sounds good.
yeah.
Thank you very much. What we did, as Mrs. Messina said, is go through the summary of our discussion the other day, and then we have come up, we have 4 major areas and 5 board members. Normally what we do is the chairman opens the interview and asks them general questions to become familiar with the candidate. So that's normally the chairman's role. And then we have 4 areas, and we ask each board member to select one area that's of their interest. Those areas are instructional leadership,
You got one down here.
business and finance. The third is board, staff, and community relationships. And the fourth is performance accountability. And then each board member would ask questions regarding that particular area that they would like to do. And we have some draft questions, like Andrea said, that we'll provide at a later time to you today. So if that sounds all right, first, okay, question.
No,
Okay.
keep going, and then
First.
I'll ask my question.
Okay, so again, instructional leadership, business and finance, board, staff, and community relations, and then performance accountability.
And then the chair would
Chair would
open,
do open and
general,
close.
and then the chair would close with another final comments.
There's something I want to add to that list, and it was on this
Okay.
workshop summary. You wrote it as continue progress addressing the desegregation order. For me, it is, in general, issues around equity and academic achievement and the deseg order, and I didn't hear that in the things that you
We
said.
have that as one of our areas.
We put it under board, staff, and community relationships, but that may not
Right.
be
Well, we
where
have
it
a
should
question on
fall,
that.
but we
That's-
did have a
that's where we
question
had
in that
there,
area.
Right, because we feel that's really important. We have that listed here. And what I'm saying is that area is, if the board member wants to take that area, the other, what we say is board members can ask follow-up questions too. So you have input on all of the different areas.
And typically, we would break it out, because we have 1 hour, so it would be about 8 minutes per board member. So you would be able to ask your question, and then if you wanted to follow up, ask another question, follow up, provided you're within those 8 minutes. Normally, I would probably kind of monitor the time so that you all can participate fully in the conversation, just to kind of keep things moving and make sure one board member doesn't use more time and leaving another board member short. Each board member would ask all candidates the same questions, because that way there's the consistency of comparison.
And we usually rotate around also
Yeah.
to that. So that question, that is one of the questions that is on our list under that area.
When you formulate this list of questions and then you give it to us, and this is so that I understand the process, do you give it to us as a draft, which we can then give back to you and say, I'd like to see this, or could we reformulate this
can
question? We
reformulate
can do
whatever
anything
you
we
want.
want
Right,
once we get,
right. What we like to do is just provide an overview of some questions based on what your thoughts were, and you certainly can reformat
You can use them or not as you see fit. We're
Right.
just trying to help
Sure.
provide you some guidance in that area and just some suggestions to help you.
Sure.
But whichever questions you ask candidate number 35 are the same questions you should ask candidate number 2, and the same questions you should ask candidate 4.
And Mrs. DeGresta has done an excellent job of circulating some questions that you might not want to ask too.
Yes.
So right, so that's, and I really commend her for doing that. So in those, right, within those guidelines, yes. Mrs. Ork, I'm sorry.
No, Andrea had touched on that we have to be consistent and ask the same questions with every candidate. But when you said you can add questions, you mean add it ahead of time, but be consistent and ask the same question
Correct.
So it doesn't mean when you're interviewing candidate 4, you can change the question when you get to candidate 35.
Correct, but you can ask follow-up questions. The follow-up questions, depending on the candidate and their response, is certainly fine, too.
Well, and I would imagine that if a candidate served as an interim, you may want to have something, you may want to ask a question specifically about that experience, and the other candidates wouldn't be able to answer that question.
Correct.
So in that case, it would be,
Or you could say, recognizing that you haven't done it, what would you see as the potential challenges, or, give them something similar, but,
Board members essentially have the flexibility. What we've done is just provide a draft for you to
Yeah.
work and utilize the way you want, and ask questions within the guidelines that Mrs. DeCresta has provided for you.
so if there's any other questions about the process, then we'll figure out who wants to do which categories of questions.
Is there a board member that would like to instructional leadership?
Ca-
Sure.
Can you clarify for me, because you said the equity and achievement gap stuff was included in one of the sections, but unless I missed it, when you read out the sections, you didn't read like the subsections of those, so I'm not sure what you're including in each of
What
those.
we try to do, you have total flexibility, and some of these, for example, strategic planning could be on several areas. You could put the desegregation issues under a number of different areas, but we put that under the area of board, staff, and community relationships, because we really feel it's a community relationship area. It could be under a different area. We put strategic planning under performance accountability. I know that was important to this board.
so I have a clarifying question to that, please. So if, let's say Dr. Schiff took that area of community relations, but then, and this is not, I'm not saying you're going to do this, but I'm
Right.
just, and then the entire line of questioning within that area was about equity in the desegregation order, and other board members didn't feel that, how do you handle that? Because I would imagine there are a number of questions you would, I'm not saying that you would, but I'm just asking out of fairness to everyone, how are those questions?
That's a follow-up question from another board member.
And as I understand it, in each category, you're listing out the specific questions, so that
Suggested
Suggested
Right, you can change it the way
questions.
you want to.
And then we'll have some discussion about those questions and some agreement, because I agree that it needs to be consistent. We need to ask the same questions to each candidate, and so I'm a
When are we
little-
having, my question, when
I
are
was
we
going to
having that
say,
discussion? We
there's
have no
not an
time for
opportunity for
discussion.
that discussion. That's the problem, and that's exactly the
We'll rely
problem.
on all of you to do that. If you don't like because the reason we did this is just to, we can provide as much specific questions or none. We'll be flexible or not flexible based on what the board wants. We wanted to give the board members some questions for them to look at and to get started.
So I heard you say that any board member can provide a follow-up question depending on what
Yes,
was said.
that's
So if
right.
she asks a question about equity and I have a follow-up question I'd like to ask about it, I can.
Absolutely.
We try to have a few minutes in there for board members.
That's what my concern is that it could get lengthy.
Yeah, so we may, because we haven't had the time to, as a board, agree on the questions, it makes sense that maybe we would have your time for each board member, and I have to pull out times and kind of juggle numbers, but it might be 7 minutes per board member asking questions, which would then allow a minute or two follow-up from other board members within that category or something like that. We'll build that in so that there's an opportunity for that in case what you're saying occurs where whatever for the category, the board member missed something that you
I
thought was
mean,
important.
like if I did business and finance and I only asked
Whichever.
questions about food services,
Right,
there might be
exactly.
board members who would say there are some other areas of business and
Yes.
finance we may be concerned about other than food services.
Exactly.
When you have a candidate, we have an hour interview, so the chair will engage the person and start the interview. Will the person be given the opportunity to kind of,
Yes.
they'll be given, not just, but to introduce themselves? How
Yes.
is that, how is that structure handled?
The chair normally does that. Welcomes them, introduces the people and the key staff in the room, reviews the process and time schedule, and then begins with the opening questions.
And the first ones really are,
Please tell us about your
yourself,
educational
that kind of stuff.
experience.
And then there's
That's
a
my-
concluding statement opportunity at the end. Is there anything else you feel like we've missed, or anything that we have overlooked or not asked about that you'd like to add to the conversation?
The only dilemma that you can come up with is this, is because of the time limit, we've provided, you normally get an opportunity to ask about two questions. And we have more questions there, so you need to prioritize your questions. So that was the only thing that could, you might not have a chance to ask all the questions. So you need to think about the ones that you feel
But I
most
will
interested
say, based on the 3 that you're interviewing, and my knowledge of them, you've got people who can do the job. It's just some nuances that you really are going to want to hone in on. 2 of them have been Florida superintendents. 1 of them has been a superintendent outside of Florida. They've done the job before. We're not talking about people who are going to have to learn certain things. So when you're asking questions, recognize these are not first-time superintendents
Right.
that you're talking to.
I'm used to this, as a principal, I always had a team.
Tell me
that-
about a time
Yeah,
when,
yeah, exactly. And that's what we do.
Yes, I know.
But, I usually had a panel interviewing even kindergarten teachers. I'd have the other kindergarten teachers there, and they did the questions. But what I always provided was a sheet where we had either a ranking sheet or something like that. So are we going to have something with the questions written down that we all agreed to, or that, they've submitted to you with either a ranking system or an area just for us to write notes?
We would typically do that. We're going to probably get these questions to each of you by the end of the day. And then if you can get your section back to me, I'll just work on that and you'll have it so that when you come in on Monday morning, in the same way you had the little charts here today, you'd have those Monday morning.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
The only thing I would say is, it's not, I don't recommend a point total. Because where, when you're making your final decision for the superintendent, there may be, you need to find the person, I think, that is the best fit. Because if you try to do it, well, this person had this points on each question, and then add them up, you're gonna know who the best fit is when you go through the interview process.
And
I wouldn't
typically, we
tie
would put
yourself to points.
strengths,
Right.
questions that I still have, that sort of thing.
Right. And that's the best, that's the way that we like to see that, strengths of questions.
Now, if you personally choose to use some mental, that's up to you, but
So I would be happy to take the business and finance section of the questions if it's
Okay.
acceptable to the rest of the board members.
is that okay with everyone?
That's right. Okay, thank you.
I mean, if you would like to do that part, please take it, and I'm happy to do something else. I'm just starting us moving in that direction.
Okay, instructional leadership?
I'm okay with either instructional leadership or board, staff, community relations.
I'm interested in both of those as well.
Okay.
Well, there goes 3 of us.
Anybody want to?
Can you repeat the categories
Yeah,
again?
one of them's performance accountability, board, staff, community relations, instructional leadership.
Hold on.
Performance,
Performance accountability.
and that includes strategic planning.
Actually, we could drop the DSEG order into performance accountability, and then that might put you onto that category.
Can you, though, before we do that, can you tell me what's in the categories, because I'm not
Okay.
clear.
Instructional leadership,
Can we even just get a copy of that, or is
Well,
that premature?
It's premature, and it's premature.
Got it.
instructional leadership, I know the board talked about improving student achievement. What strategies that the board would use to improve student achievement. Also talking about graduation rate and exceptional student performance. Business and finance, how the board, how the superintendent would restore confidence in budgeting, financial reporting, and securing the public
Let's not
trust.
read the full questions.
Let me
Let's just go to
ask,
the category.
can I ask a question? I feel like we're giving our candidates the questions ahead of time.
That's why I'm saying,
That's
let's
how
be a little
I'm-
more broad, yeah.
Board staff community relations is pretty much self-explanatory, and in performance accountability talks about the strategic plan.
If I may, are you interested in instructional leadership? Because then I can do the other one.
I'm
do
more
board,
interested in the
staff.
board information. I have a lot of background in instruction, but I'm interested in relationships with our community partners.
The questions are going to get asked. I mean,
Right.
whoever asks them, they're going to get asked.
Right.
I have
Sure, we could
priorities
do
of things I
follow-up.
want to ask.
Of course.
But
And if you want to put the DSEG information under What was the other?
Performance accountability.
Yeah, would you be comfortable with taking that, Dr. Schiff?
Sure, whatever. You know,
did
we're
you
going to
say
ask the
again?
questions.
Yeah.
My presumption is that we're going to ask a consistent set of questions, and whoever asks them, we're all going to hear the answers,
Yes,
correct?
that's true. Yes,
Absolutely, that's
yes.
right, that's right.
But yes, if we could move equity.
We'll move equity down to that category.
And what's the category? Instructional?
Performance
Performance
accountability. Accountability.
Got it, okay, I did this in a weird way.
So then I've got instructional leadership and the board staff community relations, and I heard you two, do you want to do a thumb war? What do you want to?
I don't know, my thumb's pretty strong. You know, I
Go
just,
up against you.
I have felt, I've lived in this community for 30 years, and yeah, instruction is my background in curriculum.
We could draw rocks.
So I feel
watched
very
Survivor.
comfortable
Paper,
with following
scissors.
up on that, but I feel really strongly about asking some questions or formulating some questions about our community partnerships and how
Okay,
important
so
that is.
don't worry about it.
Are
That's
you
Carrie,
fine- are you
you're
fine
going to
with
be
that?
on board
Yeah, I'm
staff?
fine. I just-
Instructional leadership, Jackie?
Yes, I just want to tie in the strategic plan. The strategic plan can be tied into all of these
Well,
categories.
instructional leadership for sure.
Yeah, I just want to be able to tie that in somewhere to
Well, you can
one
take
of my
that, yeah.
questions.
All right, so
Well,
I've got
because it
Jackie
falls
with
in line with
instructional
everything.
leadership,
Sure.
business and finance with Tiffany, board staff community relations with Terry, and performance accountability with Dr. Schiff. And
Thank
then
you.
the introductions and conclusions with the chair.
Got it.
Correct?
And then by the end of the day, Nancy will be able to.
Yes, and if you all can just communicate back to me your individual sections, if you want to edit them in any way. We're just trying to give you some general, here are some of the types of questions you might ask in this category. You can tweak them, you can change them, you can add anything you want.
Can we suggest some questions, even though it's not our section?
Sure,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Since we don't have, how does this work? We don't have time to get together again to refine and hone the questions. You're going to give us a set of questions. We're just going to give you individual feedback
On your
back to you.
category.
And then you will give some final document to all of us before Monday morning.
That is correct.
But we can't then comment on any other category. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that's, you could certainly, if you have a suggestion, you could submit it. But I'm saying that the person in charge of that category, there's going to have to be some level of trust here with your fellow board members. And if they don't ask a question that you believe is important, that would be one that you would do in the follow-up. Under normal circumstances, it's really hard to have these conversations in public about what we're going to ask questions for an interview with people coming in because it gets aired. So even under normal circumstances, it's a bit of a challenge. Typically, we would provide more than 3 or 4 questions because it would be a much longer interview, as well as you'd have individual interviews. But because we're really truncating it, if you all can really think about those priority questions that you believe you and your peers, having sat through the same meetings over the last 6 months, would want to have asked, you're going to have to at some point rely on your peers to really either ask the question or you ask it in a follow-up.
And we believe that we did take what you all talked about and.
That's
those-
where we
that's where we
formulated
would
questions.
formulate our questions for. We
Based on
put-
what
we
you
did
all
it
said.
Just for what you did.
I mean, I think that the important point, and you kind of touched on it before, is there are 3 people that are all capable of doing the job, and you get about 7 or 8 minutes to interview them. You're going to ask 1 or 2 questions. They're going to give you some answers. You're trying to get a sense of who they are and their character in that time, and I trust my fellow board members to come up with good questions that will allow us the opportunity to really get a sense of the person.
Yeah, and I think that's really what, the most important part of an interview that I've been able to witness, and we've been through a lot of interviews with a lot of candidates, in-state, out-of-state, some that look great on paper come to the interview and there is no connection. Some whose paperwork doesn't look as strong come in and knock things out of the park. We see it every time, which is one of the reasons we don't like the numerical scoring. And we don't like, for example, today's meeting, we didn't want you to come in and say, here's my top choice. Because really, what we want you to think of is these are people who are still worth considering and they all have certain levels of value, which you cannot determine completely until you meet them face to face and have that eye contact with them and really see how they interact with the board. That's really going to be the most important element in this whole process.
Thank
The
you very
human
much, Angel.
types.
So,
We
Can
have a couple
can I say
logistics.
something?
Okay.
Next steps, okay. Looking at the calendar, we will be notifying the finalists, and then we'll set the interviews up, and we'll start, we're saying 8 to 11, but we have 3 have 8 to 11:30, so is,
8 to 9, 9 to 10, 10 to 11.
Okay.
And with a little
Make
few
sure we
minutes in
got those
between,
on.
so that's the correct time.
Wait,
I'm sorry. Is this are we talking about the time for the interviews?
Yes.
So we're saying 8 to 9?
that's what we talked about, 8 to
9 to
9,
10.
9 to 10.
Well, no, there's like a 5-minute break
Right,
in the
we'll have a
middle.
break,
That's what
yeah.
I thought.
No, there was
A little bit of break in between.
correct, which is why this schedule has it advertised 8 to 11:30.
Okay.
Because we do have a brief opportunity for one candidate to leave, you all to run to the restroom if you need to, get a drink of water,
Right.
come back, start the next one.
So we will set those up. We'll also notify those candidates that are unsuccessful. too.
Correct.
We'll take care of that.
oh, well, good. Thank you
Thank you
for
for
doing that.
Yeah.
That's
Wonderful.
very respectful.
Yeah, it's important.
It is.
I agree, it is. And as we've mentioned a couple of times, some of them would be great candidates for the
Absolutely.
superintendent position. So when that becomes available, can we put in that to encourage them to please reapply?
Absolutely.
I will tell you, this is a very strong field that you have here from all over the country. It was very impressive. Okay, so after the interviews then, there's a special meeting from 1 to 3 to approve the person that you're going to recommend for board approval. Now, what will happen because of the timeline is all of your work at this will be pending, and we've talked to Mrs. DeGrest about it, completion of the process through your HR department. So what will happen on Monday, as soon as you select the person that you want to move forward, we'll take the person over to HR, they'll fill out the application, they'll do the required background checks according to statute, person will be fingerprinted, they'll be drug tested, and they will go through every process that is required under statute and also required by your district, okay? And then at the board meeting on Tuesday at 6 o'clock, you would be able to approve the contract. Also, contract negotiations will start. Mrs. DeGresta.
After the Monday.
After Monday. Mrs. DeGresta has provided, we know what the salary is, she's provided you the 2 interim contracts from Hernando and Manatee, those are the latest 2 that we have. And then we'll work through that process and we'll be able to help you with that. And then hopefully by the regular business meeting at 6 o'clock on Tuesday, the 14th, we'll have the contract done, which I don't anticipate being a problem. The only possibility might be if the drug testing results or the fingerprinting results don't come back. Your HR department people might think they think they're going to be back. So that might be a pending recommendation, and then the person should be all set to go.
Now, your HR is going to move on things quickly, but they do have to wait for things to come back from the lab and whatnot.
That's the only 2 holdups. HR is ready to go, and I'll be over there, and John Reichert will be with me. We'll be over there with them to make sure it happens. And if there are any questions on the contracts, we're also available to work with Mrs. DeGresta and whoever the applicant is.
Thank you.
I did have questions about the contract. What is the board, I mean, I know that I saw all the documents that came in. What is the board's, I mean, being a new board member, what is the board's involvement and input in things to be added into the contract? I realize that it's just interim, but if there is anything that we have suggestion for, how does that work? We don't seem to have any time to discuss that anywhere. Do we just go with what's recommended?
Yeah, I think if you have some input on the contract, you've had an opportunity to look at them, I would talk to Mrs. DeGrest about it.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say you need to submit that to Mrs. DeAgresta so that on Monday, when you all decide who you're going to do, and what we would also ask you to do is authorize Mrs. DeAgresta and probably your chair to have those conversations. So anything that you would want in that, you want to get to her in advance
Okay.
of that conversation.
Normally, there are 2 options. One, the person might be a contracted employee, and they would then they'd be paid like a 1099, or they might be on staff. And those are really, we've talked to Mrs. DeGrest about it, really it's a matter of that person's, how they would like to do that. The one question would be is if somebody is coming from out of the area, normally there is some sort of expenses, either a daily per diem or a monthly or a one-time, and that would be one question there. There's normally some leave built in, because the person may have to take some leave for whatever reason, but everything else is pretty much standard based on those contracts you have.
I have a question.
And then I see you.
Do you recommend that, or not recommend that we call these candidates before Monday?
It's a difficult decision. I actually recommend that you don't call them between now, because it's almost not fair, especially I know some of them are traveling. If they can pick up your phone but not pick up somebody else's phone, it creates what I want more than anything is for your process to be above reproach, because that way the consistency and the confidence in the process will help to build confidence, which is what you're trying to do as you're moving forward during this transition time with your community. So that would be my first thing. I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm not saying it's illegal. I'm just saying my recommendation would be that you would wait until the interview so everyone's on a fair, and if you do call one, you need to call all three. You should not just call one without calling all three. Yes, ma'am.
Good point on that. What I would like to have, because I was reading back through Dr. Parla, where he had said references upon request, I would like to request some references. Dr. Oist?
Oh, Yost.
Yost, sorry.
Mrs.
Sorry. I would like a couple of references on her, and then Dr. Moxley had a nice list of references. So I prefer that board members not call, because I feel like we should be able to call the references, but all come together and interview them at the same time. And so
I think that, I think you have had some conversations with some, I'm not criticizing you, I'm just.
No,
you know,
I
So one
did.
board member has had conversations.
Oh, I
with-
know.
I did, but I have to, let me just go on the record. We talked about this before, that we as board members could call prior to today so that we had some feedback. And in my conversations, just for the record, were not interviews. All of the candidates that I spoke with understood that it wasn't an interview. My approach was more to be able to talk about someone or recommend someone to you all on my checklist whom I have had a conversation with. We did not meet face-to-face, obviously, and it wasn't a,
I wasn't trying to criticize.
No,
your-
I know. I
because
just wanna make
We did
it-
have a conversation about that,
Yeah.
now that I'm remembering it when we spoke.
Yeah.
We did talk about that.
yeah,
so
we
it-
did. And it's okay. I just wanted to go on the record, even for the public, so no one thinks that I, went about or, did anything that I wasn't supposed to do. And in anticipation of selecting these particular people, now I can sit back and feel confident that I had a conversation with them already. And so I accept the recommendation not to call the candidates, but I certainly would love to call references to be completely thorough on that.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that as prospective, as employers, that would be something that should be prudent of all of us.
are we
If
in
we were to-
agreement on that? That
Well,
not call the
absolutely.
candidates, but call the references?
And fellow board members.
Call fellow board
Certainly.
members. That's-
Feel free to
Okay.
call fellow board
That's-
members.
we really
Okay.
encourage
That's
that.
the key,
That's-
that's.
we
That's the
recommend
one.
that.
Well, I would hope that they would give those
Board
individuals as their references.
Well, sometimes
did.
board members are no longer serving, and so they might not include their name if they're not still a board member. But if
Okay.
there's a certain board member that you want to get in touch with who served while they were serving, there's a chance that my office may have their phone number. Just tell
Okay.
me who you're looking for, and I can try to access
All right.
that data.
And I'd call some that aren't listed.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. I don't always,
I don't either,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Andrea knows every
It's a
board
good
member, every
start.
past board member. She can track them down.
yeah, typically, yeah.
Can I go on?
like a
Oh.
final word.
Dr.
Dr. Schiff, then Mrs. Rosario, then Mrs. Fahrenborg.
Yeah, on my list was about the parameters around calling. So we're now in agreement, we are not calling candidates directly. I'd like to have a little more of a conversation about if we are calling references or former board members, how that might go, and if we have anything that we want to talk about parameters in those conversations, having a conversation with an individual or several of us, by its nature, is going to happen differently, right? We're going to ask different questions, we have different attitudes, like all of those things happen, which may or may not influence the process in some way. And I'm wondering, first off, if this is one question, I have another question after. But if you have any suggestions or recommendations or advice on that, two, as you say, maintain the integrity of the process and make sure, because if somebody lists a reference, of course, it's likely they're going to give a positive reference, right? And it's possible, if not probable, that that person may or may not be in communication with the candidate themselves. So I may be overthinking it, but I want to be attentive to the integrity of the process and how we do this so that it doesn't necessarily get us in trouble in any way or influence the process. So I'd appreciate suggestions or guidelines around that, and then I have another question about something different. We can do this first, and then I want
First, we'll go with the reference questions. Typically, you're going to find the people who are listed on references, and even those who are not. Those are the ones I'm more interested in, the ones who are not listed. And typically, asking them, can you tell me about a time there was a disagreement? How did this person handle disagreement? Tell me about this person's interactions with the community. What did they look like? How did you find their leadership? You know, those more general questions. If specifically, let's go to the question you asked before about the DSEG order. If you were going to be looking through the references and say, can you tell me how this candidate handled a DSEG order? Most people aren't going to be able to answer that question for you because unless they personally were a part of that part of their work, they may not be able to explain that piece. So I think more general, less specific. And I also think you've got some guidelines from your attorney that you need to make sure and pay attention to. The one thing you don't want to do is ask sort of personal questions. I think you know this, but I just need to make it clear, you know, do you have any knowledge of this person planning to get pregnant, or I don't even know, adopt a child, or whatever it might be that would be inappropriate type questions. But the broader the better, and really, most people who are going to be providing recommendations understand the parameters under which they have the authority to share the work that with which they've interacted and how they've interacted with these people. And that's really what you mostly want to know about is the interactions they've had. Tell me about those interactions. And did you want to add anything?
That was it. That's excellent.
Then my second question is a follow-up on Mrs. Rosario's question about the contract. If there are things that a board member wanted to see in a contract and was having discussions with Ms. DeGresta about that, is that something, because obviously we can't discuss that until we're noticed.
Monday, when we have that
Until
time.
well, Monday, and if we're, I guess we could talk about it in a discussion in the afternoon on Monday, because
Yes.
want to make sure that all board members are aware of other board members' concerns and anything they might want or not want to put in a contract. And I just want to make sure that we discuss that before we approve a contract, or if, for whatever reason, we're not able to discuss that, that when we meet on Tuesday, we say, are we able to say, this is who we're approving, you know, I don't know the language, you know, pending agreement on the contract negotiations, or does that all?
It would be, that'd all be pending, right. If you offer the job, pending completion of the HR requirements and agreement with the contract.
I will say this about contracts. In the Monday afternoon, when you decide who you're going to want to enter into negotiations with, if you have not already told Mrs. DeGresta that you're looking for certain pieces in a contract, you want to get them to her before that Monday afternoon conversation. But I also need to tell you, with regard to contracts, and we've actually just recently, within the last few months, almost seen a district lose a really good superintendent over a $5,000 conversation. And while you need to be and this board has exhibited time and time again, fiscal responsibility and commitment to your community and awareness and stewardship. I don't see how your community could ever argue against that you all have done that with fidelity. I would also encourage you to not get caught up too much in one or another small sections of a contract. Because the overall goal is to get the district moving forward, and effective leadership can do that. And we already know the salary. That's really typically the most difficult one. So that piece you've already agreed to. There shouldn't be, that's why he said he doesn't predict a lot of challenges with the contract. Shouldn't be a lot of things that are going to get caught up in that process. It should move pretty smoothly. And again, I go back to, you've got an attorney who has worked with you all, kind of knows what you're looking for. If you submit the things to her in advance, you may have to extend a small amount of trust that she's going to develop and do that. And in the negotiations, there may be something that we don't know about right now, that one of these three people, it's important to them to get a 2-week vacation because they've already booked their 50th wedding anniversary with 300 family members. Okay, that might be something they would want to put in the contract that we would never have been able to predict. So there's going to have to be an extension of some level of confidence in your attorney to bring you something that's palatable to everyone.
Can I?
Sure.
My understanding, there's 2 different contracts that you had proposed to
Correct.
Mrs. Diagrasta, one with the Florida certification as a requirement to obtain that Florida certification within a certain period of time.
That would be for a permanent
leadership.
superintendent.
For a permanent superintendent.
But if you're saying for a permanent, so for, because I noticed Dr. Parla has that Florida leadership certification. So you're
We would not put that
suggesting-
in an
Right.
interim's contract. We submitted contracts, was that in one of those contracts?
That, I don't
Remember
think
that.
so. I don't think so. Because it's
Not for
not
an interim.
required, Florida does not require the superintendent has any specific
Okay.
certification or that in there. He just, so that wouldn't restrict him
All right.
if he doesn't have that.
Right, but not for an interim, so it's
Right,
not,
right.
it's
That's
not
right,
for this
absolutely
contract.
right.
I mean, the interim contracts were fairly similar in general. I
Right.
mean, I don't.
What I'd like to do, if I could, is just let me run through this real quickly and to see, just make sure everybody is okay. The term normally would be 6 months to a year, unless you find a permanent superintendent earlier. And then each side gives 30 days' notice or something to that effect. That's usually there. We talked about the compensation fringe benefits are normally what every other 12-month person is getting, unless the person, for some reason, wants to work as just a contract person only on a 1099 form. If they don't need health insurance, they don't want to deal with that. Normally, there's an automobile expense given. Whatever you're given now, probably.
Your superintendent now probably has that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Oh, well, the next one you hire is going to probably,
That's
because
fine.
everybody
It's not
else
in the
does.
contract.
Everybody does.
There's nothing in the contract about that.
Is there any? But,
But any employee can be reimbursed for
Yeah.
mileage.
right.
Yes.
it's
You
not
can
right.
either reimburse for
Right.
mileage.
Okay, that's
If you don't
true.
want to
You
pay
can
a
reimburse
number.
for
you
mileage,
can
but
reimburse
there's
for
no
mile-
specific-
Okay,
All
I'm
right.
hearing reimburse for mileage, we got that. Cell phone, one thing that we don't recommend putting anything in there, one of those contracts has it where the interim can't apply for the regular job. We strongly recommend don't put that in there, because the district, if it had that in there, had to take that out. Because all it does is tie your hands, you know. Okay, we've got the 30-day clause in there. Basically, then the only other thing that I see is going to be how you would deal with leave, whether it's, like Andrea said, maybe with the same benefits and leave that all other 12-month persons get. So really, and then I would put some evaluation clause in there, and then all of the other legal aspects of it. I mean, and if they want to have a termination clause in there, it could be for cause or not cause. Either for cause, certainly, we know the reasons for cause, but for not cause, either side can terminate the contract without cause, giving the party, each person 30-day notice without cause. So that gives the board protection there.
Yeah.
So that, basically, that's all it really is to it.
Yeah, they're going to perform the functions as
Right.
defined in statute.
Right. And you have a job description for it, so.
Just a statement. I know that when we call for references, and in my experience, when someone called me for a reference, I knew I had to be very careful in what I said.
They worked with
So
us from
just know
time
you
A
know
to time
that.
B.
Right. And a good question I used to, so the first question I asked was, would you rehire this person?
Yes. Mhm.
And the reason why that's a good question is it's open-ended. It doesn't get into specifics that they can't talk about. It gives you a very firm yes or a very firm no. It's a great opening because then you either finish, you have further discussion, or you just say, okay, thank you. And that's just my 2 cents. Just because I've been in that position where somebody is calling you for a reference, you have to be very careful on your end what you say. So just know that if you're feeling like they're not telling you something, it's probably because they can't.
I would also add something I always do, is I always leave an open-ended question at the end. Is there anything I haven't asked you that you would like to, you think I should know, or that you'd like to share with me? And that often provides something interesting.
Yeah.
I'm fine with the contract as discussed. I don't have anything to.
I think it's really helpful to just to talk a little bit about the contract like this, because I think this always helps in the rest of coming to a quick resolution with a successful
No
person.
pressure.
Less than 24 hours. Could be fine.
We have trust in you. I just wanted to thank you both for coming and for facilitating all of this. A week ago, I had no idea how this would look. A week ago, I was pulling out my hair, wondering what in the world are we going to do and how are we going to go about, what's our first step? And I utilized everything that you all gave. And I spent,
Hours.
I did. But, to be honest, I was a little taken aback when I heard that you were not going to sift through all of them and come with your recommended. But in a way, I was glad, and I don't know how, my fellow board members feel, but I was glad because it gave me an opportunity to really go through it myself, each one, and rate each one according to the rubric that you shared. And how you facilitated today with these charts and, allowing us to just focus on the highest number. I mean, it was just, everything that you have done thus far has been extremely helpful. And I just wanted to thank you both for that. And I want to thank FSBA. I'm glad that we made the decision to ask you to help us through this transition. And I'm very pleased. I feel like there's a weight lifted off of us, that we're moving in the right direction, that we can come on Monday and we have, we know what to expect. We know what's happening, and I'm very pleased about that. So I wanted to formally say thank you to
You're
both of
welcome.
you for that.
I want to say thank you to Mrs. Zork for continuing to move us through this process. Thank you very much, and working with FSBA. I also just want to take a second, because I know there are probably some people watching, to say thank you to the local candidates again that applied. Dr. Peggy Jones and Dr. Deering, I did mark Dr. Deering down on the list and did mark Peggy Jones down because I just want them to know the fact that I so respect that they care about our community so much, and this district, that they would want to come back to help us through this difficult time. And while they won't be interviewed for the position, that they are valued and respected, and I hope that they continue to remain involved, and I personally am open to whatever feedback they'd like to give through this process.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you again, because it is a difficult process to lead our board through this first-time experience, and I think it went very smoothly. I'm really hopeful that we're going to find somebody. I know, I'm very hopeful that we're going to find somebody dynamic, and I'd just like to say thank you again to of course, all the local people that applied, and they're very valid, and of course, we'd love to have a couple of people in this job, but I know we can only have one. And I also like to thank all those people that submitted resumes. It's interesting when you get resumes for a position and they put themselves out there, and it takes time and work and effort, and I appreciate the fact that they applied, so thank you.
And I would like to say on behalf of the candidates with whom I spoke, and many of them before they submitted called, because we said if you have questions, call. Bill spoke to many, I spoke to many, but to a person, they said, if the board decides that I'm the best candidate, I would love to be able to help them. If they decide there's another candidate, I respect that and hope that they can find their way. I hope that they can find somebody that will work for them. So the candidates want you all to be successful in this effort as well. So
Thank you.
it was really good people.
And we're here, once the candidate is selected, we're always here for you individually or through the FSBA. Any way we can support a successful transition with the new superintendent.
Thank you.
So your weekend homework, get anything on the contract to Ms. DeGresta, and your questions, we will communicate directly on your category section.
What time would you like them back on Sunday? What, you want them back by noon?
If you could get me back by noon on Sunday, that'll be helpful, so I can create the little chart. Thank you.
All right. Anyone else? Are we good? Okay, I just want to say thank you to all my board members, our fellow board members, because this was a good meeting, a good start to a new beginning. So I appreciate, it seems like we've really come together around the candidates that we're going to interview. I'm very pleased, and I know any of the three that if we choose either, we're going to have a successful interim superintendent. And I appreciate the candidates that did apply. They fantastic pool of candidates, and I hope that they'll keep it open to whenever we do need a superintendent full-time. And I just want to say thank you. This did go really smoothly, despite what was said about some of the meetings. I think we're moving in the right direction, so I appreciate the FSBA for being here. With nothing else being said, we'll adjourn this at 10:45.
Thank you.